All right, good morning, everybody, and welcome to day 2 of the West Conference. So today we're going to start with the second keynote presentation of the conference, which is by Oliver Brenz and Rosie Sims from the POLIS Water Sustainability Project. Joanne will hopefully be joining us soon, and she can moderate questions at the end of the talk. So throughout the talk, if you have any questions or comments that you'd like to ask of our presenters, please feel free to add them to the chat box, and then we'll get to those at the end. All right, so today's speakers are from the POLIS Water Sustainability Project based at the University of Victoria's Center for Global Studies. And their focus initiative of the POLIS project on ecological governance. Its mission is to drive innovative water and watershed law, policy and governance reform, and to generate change towards a sustainable freshwater future. So Oliver Brands is the co-director, and his work focuses on water sustainability, sound resource management, public policy development, and ecologically based legal and institutional reform. Rosie Sims is an MA graduate from UBC's Institute of Resources, Environment, Sustainability, is the research lead and project manager whose work includes applied research and communicating new thinking on water governance, law, and policy. She also plays an active role supporting partners on strategic initiatives, convening BC water leaders and networks, and engaging with all levels of government and communities to help inform their water programs and priorities. So with that, I will stop sharing and hand it over to the POLIS team to give us our presentation this morning. So welcome, and thank you to both our presenters and for everybody in the audience for joining us today.
Thanks very much, Carl. I think Oliver is going to pull up slides and drive from his computer.
Yeah, hi everybody. I am indeed doing the technical piece here. Let me know, Rosie, if you're seeing what you think you should be seeing.
Yeah, that looks good. I think we're good to go here.
Good.
Great. Thanks so much for the introduction, Carl, and good morning, everyone. It's great to see you all. Some familiar faces, lots of new names, and wow, what like a global coverage the West Conference has grown to have over the past 5-6 years. It's really exciting to see. I imagine lots of you are in very different time zones from where we are, so yeah, it's just always neat to see such a global interest in these topics. So I think next slide, Oliver. So this is what we're hoping to cover off with you folks in the next hour or so, and we'll make sure we have time for discussion and question and answers. We'll do a bit of a water issues tour, so zooming in from the global to the local, which really sets up for the need to do things differently with respect to water governance, law, policy. We'll do a tour of those issues specifically in British Columbia and present some of the new opportunities with our new provincial government mandate around watershed security. And then, of course, we'll do our favorite looking into the future with our crystal ball and looking to what next and some predictions. So I think Carl introduced POLIS very nicely there, but I guess just a couple of things to flag about who we are and what we do. So again, we're based in Victoria in the territories of the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wasanich nations. And we call ourselves both a think tank, but also a do tank, so a think and do. And really that's to just emphasize that research is a big part of what we do, and it's very much an applied approach to research that's informing policy governance and law reform. So there's a very strong research component, but equally we're looking to apply that to drive change on the ground. And so we're fortunate to work across a number of different networks, to work directly with governments, Indigenous governments, and to support these initiatives that are happening in place in communities across British Columbia, Canada, and beyond. So I guess just starting kind of at the very highest level in terms of our global water issues tour, this quote is one I always come back to, and this is from Mark de Villiers, and he writes that the trouble with water, and there is trouble with water, is that they aren't making any more of it. And so of course, when we're working with a resource that is finite, that creates real challenges for how it's managed and governed. And it's not only finite, but of course it flows across borders and isn't constrained to our political boundaries. And so water is this really complex and fascinating kind of meeting point of issues. And I think it offers a way to bring people together as well. So of course, I know lots of you are situated around the globe, and this isn't going to come to news to anyone on this call, but the World Economic Forum has listed water crisis as a top global risk, or in the top 5 global risks for the past 8 consecutive years. So we know that there are problems globally that are driving real changes around the world. Next slide, please. And I think in British Columbia, these are the sorts of images that come to mind when we think about our province. Very often, you know, lush, green, water everywhere, rainy. And certainly that's true of some places at some times of the year, but it's not the reality on the ground in a lot of parts of the province. And so we wanted to just zoom in to start with 2 specific little stories about that really kind of are microcosms of the issues we're seeing across British Columbia. And so on the left of the slide here, that's a photo of Tim Kolcheski. He's a biologist with Cowichan tribes, and he's standing in the Cowichan water, or in the Cowichan River, the dry Cowichan River. This is on the eastern coast of Vancouver Island. And the Cowichan and the neighboring watershed, which is known as the Coxsila watershed, are really harbingers, I think, of climate change and the types of pressures that are facing a number of watersheds in BC. And so summer flows in these rivers have dropped dramatically. There was a major crisis in 2003 where salmon had to be trucked upstream because the river was so low. And in the neighboring Coxsila watershed, in 2019, the province had to issue an order for farmers and industrial water users to stop using water because the river flows were too low. So again, just to make the point that yes, perhaps in the winter months, these watersheds have adequate flows, but in the summer, we're seeing really complex challenges start to emerge with water scarcity, water shortage issues. And Oliver, did you want to speak to the Halkar?
Yeah, and the other sort of portent of a future is a place called the Halkar Aquifer. It's in the northern tip of the Okanagan Valley near Armstrong. It's in the Splatsin Nation territory. And it's a classic whodunit. It's you got local drinking water compromise. You have a whole bunch of contributing factors. You have scientific uncertainty. You have a mix of a health risk, a pollution problem. Maybe it's both. Some people called it a nitrate time bomb. And it is really the sort of friction point of source protection and the many activities on the landscape. And layered on that, you have some governance problems in the form of 5+ key ministries questioning who's in charge, from the Ministry of Agriculture, Ministry of Health, Ministry of Environment, Flinrord, MER, plus an interagency working committee. You have other players like Interior Health. We have the Splatsin Nation, as I mentioned, local government, water district, all wondering how they're going to resolve this problem of nitrate affecting drinking water, all coupled on a layer of scientific uncertainty and uncertainty about how the groundwater and surface water interact and how land use practices are changing the whole dynamic and affecting the community health and welfare.
So again, those 2 case stories, and we're happy to kind of discuss where they're at now in terms of responding to those issues. But I think, again, they're demonstrative of some of the pressures we're starting to see, these pattern problems that are showing up across watersheds in British Columbia. So again, we're not immune to the sorts of challenges that are happening globally with growing and competing water demands, a history of not giving water priority in our land use practices, in our land use planning, over allocation, drinking water issues. So, and again, just to highlight that a lot of these impacts are felt disproportionately by Indigenous communities and in rural areas as well. You can click through these next 2 pieces, Oliver. And we have been experiencing kind of more regular, intense droughts in the province. I'm sure lots of you remember this kind of sequence from 2015, 2018, 2019, and certainly looking like another dry summer ahead. And so we've kind of called this Californication of the West. I'm not sure if any of you are following the stories in the Klamath right now, but it's it's a potentially scary future as these things become ramped up, as these issues intensify. So this is not to just, start the morning with doom and gloom, but just to kind of paint a picture of the reality here in BC. And the last point I'll make here, these are words from our Auditor General in 2019, who conducted an audit of drinking water, kind of the adequacy of drinking water protection in the province, and found that the province's ability and accountability to provide safe drinking water of grave concern. And so we have world-class drinking water protection in our urban centers, Victoria and Vancouver, but really as soon as you head into rural regions, the issues are quite acute, as drinking water watersheds aren't protected from other uses concurrently happening in those areas. But here's a little bit of good news, and I think I mentioned this already. Water, there really is a kind of a consensus around water. This is from some recent public polling in British Columbia. So 93% of British Columbians agree that water is our most precious natural resource. There's a strong call for greater community say, for greater local control in decision making. So 80% of folks support that statement, support that vision. And then there's a quite low degree of confidence in the fact, in kind of the current level of protections for and management for water in BC. And so when you take the pulse kind of the broad public across BC, we do see that water is seen as a key priority and the most precious resource for the province.
So I think with that, we pivot. This is our version of a duet that we are entertaining you with this morning. And I'm going to offer us the beginnings of a deeper dive into this concepts around watershed, law, governance, and security in particular, but of course with that important water central focus. And one important comment I'll make before we kind of dive into it is to recognize that these are what I'm going to call the human part of the problem, or the human part of the solution. We know that humans are creating many of the problems, or things like climate change amplifying many of the problems that are happening on the ground. But these are the way we respond as a society, as individuals, as governments, collectively. And often the point to recognize is these responses come as a result of the problem. So often beautiful places with pristine watersheds don't have great water laws. The places that have years and history of challenge often have interesting and innovative tools. And BC's in this interesting transition. And let's discuss it a little bit. The first sort of principle here is that as governments and societies respond, it's usually because there's a problem. And there was lots of trouble in the water, and this isn't new news. There's at least 20, 30 years of consistent, persistent kinds of problems amplifying. And in the early aughts, we see this awakening to a new reality, and we see this policy window, some political commitments. I love a good little bit of policy history, but I won't give you that this morning unless you want to dive into that a little bit later. But that yields the Water Sustainability Act, which is the Crown legislation. And it's really important because in a future-oriented session like today, I want you to have this in your mind, because water laws are going to be a whole lot more important in the future than they were in the past. They have a sort of a long history. Certainly in BC, we have this colonial water law foundation under the old BC Water Act, over 100 years old. So 1909, there were even rules before then, but it was really about facilitating gold mining and agricultural development. And I went to law school because I was very interested in governance. I was very interested in environmental law. I was very interested in how governments interact. And I came very quickly to realize that the water law was not an environmental law. It was resource extraction rules, pure and simple. And it had a couple major defects. The most obvious is that it outright ignored Indigenous rights and title and simply asserted Crown ownership. So that's a really important governance consideration. It was built on sort of 4 core principles, very common principles of Western water law. This idea of Crown ownership is one important piece, and we can discuss that a bit too in why that is fundamentally being shifted. But there's a couple other important pieces. The first is FIFR, and that's that idea of first in time, first in right. And that's where I always ask the question, who's familiar with that? And most water people have an idea, but most non-water people have no idea. And I always try and emphasize that that's really a story that we've all learned in kindergarten. It's the I had it, or who had it first. I had it first, so it's mine kind of principle. And that is codified in the legal system. So the people who did their paperwork got access to the water first. They use all their water, and then the next user can get it. And that makes a lot of sense in a world where you have lots of water, you have relatively little demand, you have relatively low activity. It doesn't make a lot of sense when you have shifting priorities, shifting climate, shifting hydrology, and you have ever increasing demands and understanding around how water interacts. Of course, FIPFR failed miserably because the very first users, the Indigenous nations of BC, were largely ignored in this process as well. And then there's a number of other really critical linkages, which really emphasize this idea of water as a commodity, the idea of it, a clear link to beneficial use, which meant, are you putting the water to an economic benefit? Are you making money, and are you paying money to use it? Then it's beneficial. And if you didn't use it, you would lose it. So it really sort of created a counter incentive to conservation. And then very standard in at least Canadian environmental law, we have this management and enforcement through administrative action, very reliant on statutory decision-making, very centralized through the Crown government, but creating very siloed or fragmented decisions amongst the various ministers or ministries. Of course, this makes about 0 sense in a modern world. So in the 1909 world, you might make a case that that has some merit. But in a modern world, we see all these integrated uses, different demands, different priorities. You have to see it in a different way. And that's what I think is a part of the positive story here. And I really want to emphasize a couple of important pieces. That the Water Sustainability Act is a Crown piece of legislation. And I come from a training in law where we think about it, at least BC, Canada, is multi-judicial. We already understand that with common law, civil law, but increasingly societies begin to understand the importance of Indigenous laws. And that's the same way with water laws. And we see that the Water Sustainability Act right in the middle here in the Crown bundle is still part of a much larger story about Indigenous water laws, about important declarations, about like UNDRIP, and understanding the BC Water Act or Water Sustainability Act in the context of the broader mix of the many, both provincial legislation, but also local government, municipal law, and federal law. So I won't do the whole thing, but I wanted to give you that glimpse. And I want to really emphasize that historically, this image captured how water lawyers thought about water. It was really about two things. It was about making the water safe to drink and making sure there's just enough for fish to survive. So it's about the minimum and the sort of technical requirements. And that is also a fundamental shift. And that is what is embodied in this Water Sustainability Act. Of course, there are many defects that we could talk about, but there's a number of really positive pieces. And just to kind of give you a glimpse, we have this now in force for about 5 years, but yet it remains very much in progress, like a house under renovation, because it's an enabling act. Again, very common in Canada, which is you create a good superstructure, but you use regulations and some of the important orders and provisions to build out the structure, the institutional structure in this case. I think it's important to recognize, what's changed or what's new. The first and obvious piece, which was really the big driver at the time, was the idea of extending the legal regime, the licensing regime to groundwater. And that happened. It's still in process, and we can discuss that. But there were a number of very important sustainability features or contributions. The first and obvious was a more formalized legal protection for environmental flows and better linkages on that land water. So it begins to think about water in its context, in its watershed context. FIPFR, as we know, is very problematic. This idea of first in time, first in right creates a real break on invention and innovation, but it also can create that sort of misaligned priorities around conservation. So you really have a problem, but you have a number of tools now that get you off that sort of FIPFR problem. And one of the things that I think is most interesting, or certainly at POLIS we think is most interesting, is the spaces for partnerships, for much more of a delegated or shared authority system, and explicit spaces where Indigenous water law can coexist in the Crown legal system. So these are very positive trends. These are things worth watching when you're thinking in a future orientation, because this is why water law will matter a whole lot more. And just to make it kind of simple, you know, the top image is how the old system worked. We handed out all the licenses until the humans dominated the use of water and there was nothing left for the environment. And this tries to reallocate or situate that to create these ecosystem and cultural based boundaries within which human use needs to be fit, rather than the other way around, where it just over time diminishes what's available. And the strongest piece to me is that linkage between environmental flows, which in simple terms is that life pulse of a river, and the really critical Indigenous rights and uses, whether we're talking the direct pieces like fisheries, also sacred uses, but the idea that it's an expression or a way that self-government, self-determination show up by co-governing water in this way. And you know, for the legal oriented of the crew here, there's a whole bunch of very interesting technical planning and institutional tools that can be used to help drive very specific responses to the kinds of problems that we've already introduced. And I just, for a simple hierarchy, show you how they can be fairly simple, like a spork, the old water objectives that are fairly applied and specific, all the way to the very complex Swiss Army knife of water sustainability plans, or the various designations that are possible, which are quite context specific. But I'll leave you with the thought or the concern that there is a big implementation gap. So there's a gap, and we don't know if this person's going to make the leap or not. We're hoping, of course, and that's exactly where we are with our water legal infrastructure. We see laws and governance systems are always evolving, always changing, but we really have a severe moment in time now where we are seeing the mounting of the problems, and we aren't seeing the ability to deploy the tools quite fast enough yet. And at this point, I'm just going to introduce the idea that we have to be thinking in this bigger governance context. And that is really where the Act fell down. All the key tools and provisions and planning provisions are really triggered through the more standard approach, through the minister or a ministerial order or statutory decision maker, which has all the problems of this more static system. And if we think about trying to integrate into a broader governance system with multiple authorities, the idea that governance is central. And I think public and communities intuitively understand this well, that good governance involves a mix of expertise, science, traditional knowledge, rules and enforcement, and citizens, local control, and co-governance as an increasing priority, especially under UNDRIP and the reconciliation mandate that is becoming omnipresent. And I'm going to pass it back to Rosie for a little foray.
Thanks, Oliver. I think we've made this point through the Hulkar example already, but really when we're talking about governance, it comes back to this fundamental question of who decides about water and how. And of course, we know that water doesn't follow jurisdictional boundaries, but again, there's this real layering of authorities in British Columbia. So of course, Indigenous nations have an inherent laws and authority since time immemorial on these landscapes in their territories. And then you overlay at least 3 other orders of government, so federal, provincial, and municipal, and you end up with quite a messy kind of governance situation. And so we talk often about silo busting as being a key aspect of governance moving forward, and that doing that in a place-based, watershed-based way is an opportunity to bridge the land and water divide and integrate these different authorities to make decisions effectively for land and water. Next slide, Oliver. So back in 2014, POLIS, with a number of different partners, did some extensive research to understand what actually does it take to shift towards this more integrated watershed-based approach. And with that, identified a number of winning conditions. And so I just wanted to point to this co-governance winning condition as one that, again, as Oliver's mentioned, is kind of gaining momentum with a lot of interesting developments happening in BC and beyond. And if we go to the next slide, one of the real drivers and kind of opportunity spaces in BC came with or comes with the passing of the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act in British Columbia. And so this is a new law in BC that now requires the province to take all measures necessary to make sure that British Columbia laws are consistent with UNDRIP. And it also creates space for new decision-making agreements based on consent, free, prior, and informed consent, and joint decision-making between Indigenous nations, Indigenous governing bodies, and the province. And so again, there's this real moment of shift in BC in terms of how decisions are made, not just for water, but for a number of different areas, whether that's land, territory, childcare. But I think we see water as very central to this shift towards making reconciliation real in the province. Next slide. And again, we're happy to pick up on any of these examples, but there's some real beacons of where this work is landing in BC with new and innovative and very exciting agreements and plans going forward. So again, coming back to the Coxsala, to the Cowichan watershed, which was that dry riverbed we showed, they're currently engaged in a co-governance process. They're scoping a potential plan for the region, and it's happening very much based on both Cowichan Tribes Authority and Provincial Authority working together. Up in the Nicola, where there's also been some real challenges around water scarcity, there's a memorandum of understanding that's guiding work between the Nicola nations and the province on how they're going to work together to address those challenges in a partnership way going forward. And then there's a whole handful of different pathways and initiatives led by Indigenous nations themselves, kind of really getting out in front. So determining their own Indigenous policies in the Nechako, the Nadle-Wooten water policy standards, and leading the way on land use planning and showing what integration of land and water can look like. And I just highlight the Git and Yow plan as a real example there.
So I think it comes back to me as we begin to pivot away from what I'm going to call the natural or the evolution of governance on the ground to some of what the provincial government is now thinking about. And so we have a new government, a newish government. And what's interesting about this government, it came in with a number of promises and commitments. And the interesting mix, I'm not sure if that's me ringing. Oh, sorry guys, I had my phone on. So we have about 5 sort of significant promises or areas of commitment. And these areas range from, as we talked about, reconciliation and DRIPA. We talked about the land use piece, the climate adaptation piece, but of course, central to this government was a commitment around watershed security and strategy fund. And so we have this very interesting idea of not just water as a singular priority, but water as part of a larger mix. And for people like Rosie and I think many of the audience, this idea of water in its integrated context becomes a lot more interesting because it requires a much more overt attention to the governance piece and water as a cross-cutting priority. So you're not just protecting water in and of itself, but you're thinking about water in its sort of social context. And so I just have this a little bit of a busy slide, but I really just want to help people really drive home this notion. So if we have this central commitment around watershed security strategy and fund, we have about 3 significant cross-government priorities, clearly stated, clearly mandated, comes right out of the Premier's office around reconciliation, around economic recovery, and around stewardship and climate change or climate and adaptation. And if you think of these 3 things, they become only possible when we begin to bring in that water lens. There is no practical path forward on reconciliation without taking water part seriously, whether it's part of the land management, it's self-determination, it's about expression of Indigenous rights and authority. It shows up in so many critical ways. And when we think about economic recovery, a lot of the jobs and opportunities are possible because of what water enables. And that's a big advantage that BC has and increasingly understood. And of course, we know that water is a critical integrator across the landscape. And that links to this idea of climate adaptation and even stewardship. If we think about the recent announcements about old growth deferrals, the importance of old growth in key source areas or groundwater recharge areas really amplifies the importance of not just protecting large old trees and the biodiversity there, but the water system within which it's housed. And that is this notion of watershed security coming front and center. For us, we've done a bit of work on this, and we've really emphasized that it's a mix of the water quality and quantity. It's about decisions and governance, and it's about this integrated and nested systems approach. So like 3 Venn diagrams, when you get these 3 things right and overlapping, you begin to move towards watershed security as an opportunity. And I'm going to leave this part of the conversation with what I call one big idea. What's one big idea that would help government actually demonstrate the kind of leadership and the kinds of integrated approach we would like to see? Now, again, recognizing that I'm talking about the big picture of water, and we know there are many players, many levels of government. So what can the province do specifically? And we've all had a very challenging year, and we've come to know this person very well. This is the Provincial Health Officer, Bonnie Henry. But of course, we have seen how important or how useful that kind of a role can play. Water is just as important in my view, not as acute, obviously, as a COVID crisis, but as impactful, both in our health, in our economics, in our long-term prosperity. And so the idea of perhaps a provincial watershed security officer begins to bring some traction. So this is the big idea of how we can use that blending of credible science and evidence-based decision-making, drive the change, and really that important backstop function, so that when commitments are made or when enforcement actions are needed, like in the Hulkar or the Koksala, as we talked about, we know somebody has the capacity and abilities and jurisdiction to do those changes and see them through. So that's kind of the where we are. So my next sort of couple of minutes, Rosie and I want to indulge a little bit in, where to next. So again, we understand that the theme of this conference is really about the future. And so we're going to throw some ideas out there to see what you think, or places where we think you should keep your eyes going to this future. And this is one of my favorite slides, because it shows some, not all, some of the important trends and opportunities that POLIS has certainly been tracking for the last 20 years or so. And I call these the big ideas in the water world. And these are all solutions. And that's one of the things I like about them. They're all solutions oriented. They're about different ways of how we do things. And I think all of these are relevant. They may have different relevance in BC than other places, but they all have something interesting. And that is not only this solutions orientation, but really fundamentally the idea of innovation, the idea that we need to start doing some things differently. And these pieces, whether it's environmental flows, which integrates the ecosystem and the social system, whether it's the notion of watershed security, where we need to keep source protection as a priority for society, or even as unique, certainly in its time, the idea of rivers with rights. But the fundamental point is that we have to get to a watershed governance regime where shared decision-making at the watershed scale really isn't an if question, but a when question. And I'm going to leave this slide with you as well as you think about this future and drivers of change, and you think about early careers. Where do you really want to orient your energy? And I think these are the 5 kinds of really critical drivers that are going to touch on your work no matter what you do. But I think there's an important little story here, and that's the idea of water, land, and climate resilience. We have this idea of carbon neutrality being just absolutely necessary. It's going to be essential. It's going to likely be back-end loaded. We know the climate will never be better than now. It probably only gets more challenging. We know that water in all its forms will be more varied and more insecure. We know that adaptation and captured carbon will become highly valuable commodities, and that not only will we have carbon offset markets, but we'll have to think about our land base in an entirely different way. So then that enters this whole of watershed approach, where current forest and land use policies will just need to shift. Bottom line, biodiversity and conservation as the overriding objective, rather than just being a constraint to other development. We're going to have to protect more of the land base, but soil and watershed management will shift from carbon sources to carbon sinks. through this regenerative, both agriculture and forest practices. This future will focus on security, resilience, and climate adaptation, which brings us back to where we started. Water will be at the center of this story. There is no future, there's no future place that doesn't have to address this mix of things. So to the young professionals thinking about water careers, I think you're in a very exciting time. I think you're going to have some challenges. You're going to have to think about scarcity and risk in unique ways. You're going to have to be very creative because you're going to be dealing in a constant world of uncertainty where resilience becomes central. And you're going to have to do the brain-bending work of thinking about how do whole systems work together, not just the laws and policies, not just provincial laws and policies, but how does it intermix with Indigenous laws? How do you have multi-layered governance? How do you bring local control in a way that is legitimate and credible and accountable? So this is some of the challenge and maybe something we can explore as we begin our dialogue or our conversation part. As I flip up the last slide and give the last word to our friend Rosie.
Thanks, Oliver. Yeah, I wanted to share this slide as a wrap up. This comes from folks in the Cowichan Watershed Board. And this concept is a Cowichan legal principle, this concept of Nutsamat, which is that we come together as a whole to work together to be stronger as partners for the watershed. And I think that with that as kind of a guiding vision and a guiding principle, amazing work can be achieved in the Cowichan and beyond. And so I think that's the conclusion of our kind of formal presentation, and certainly let's move into discussion. One thing I also just wanted to say is that so I finished at UBC 6 years ago and transitioned to work at POLIS, and so I just wanted to emphasize that we're always interested in connecting with students. There's lots of opportunities for young professionals in this field, and happy to follow up and discuss with any of you what that looks like.